How medieval peasants survived the coldest nights. Chapter 1. When winter came, long ago, when the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and the night stretched on forever. There were no glowing lamps, no central heat, no electric blankets, just wind, stone, and fire that had to be earned. In a small village somewhere in the rolling fields of medieval Europe, a cold came not as a surprise, but as a slow, creeping hush. The birds disappeared. The last apples fell. The breath of animals lingered in the air like little clouds of ghosts. Inside a cottage of mud and timber, a family of 6 prepared for what they called the deep nights. Mother gathered old cloaks. Father sealed the cracks with straw and clay. Children fed the last of the dry sticks into the hearth. They had no calendar, but their bones knew the coldest weeks were near. And so, as snow fell softly on thatched roofs, the peasant families did what they had always done. They drew close. They shared everything: fire, food, warmth, and silence. Even time itself seemed to slow, like the world was falling asleep. Chapter 2. Sleeping with the sheep. The cottage was small, one room, low ceilings, smoke curling toward a hole in the roof. No bedrooms, no privacy, just people and animals, because in those days, warmth didn't come from machines, it came from life itself. At night, the sheep were herded inside. So were the chickens, the dog, even a quiet old goat. Their warmth was precious. Their breath was soft. Their closeness was comfort. The floor was packed earth, scattered with straw. In the corner, a bed made of ropes and worn linen. And next to it, sleeping bundles of cloth, children, arms wrapped around each other, noses buried in wool scarves. Sometimes, the youngest child would sleep between the goat and the dog, the goat for body heat, the dog for love. They didn't change into night clothes because day and night were worn on the same skin. They didn't light candles unless they must, wax was too dear. And when the last ember faded to red, and the dark closed in, they huddled. They dreamed. And hoped to wake up still warm. Chapter 3. A spoonful of heat. Before the coldest nights, they ate with purpose. A pot hung over the fire full of barley, turnips, and cabbage. Maybe a bit of pork fat if the year had been kind. This wasn't just supper. It was fuel. A spoonful of warmth that would burn inside the belly for hours. As steam rose from the pot, the children cupped their hands around wooden bowls. The parents waited to eat last, watching, always, making sure there was enough. After dinner, they drank something warm if they had it, watered ale, or hot water steeped with dried herbs, thyme, sage, maybe a sliver of honeycomb, saved from autumn, and then they would talk softly. In the glow of the fire, not stories of heroes, but stories of last winter, when the frost crept across the ceiling beams, when the neighbor's roof collapsed, when the cow gave birth in the middle of a storm. These stories weren't scary. They were survival songs, memories that reminded them, you've done this before, you'll do it again, you know how to last. Chapter 4. When the fire went out, even the most careful family couldn't keep the fire burning forever. Some nights, the wind would slip through the roof and tease the coals until they died in silence. And when the fire went out, there was no panic. There was just darkness, and breath, and cold. The father would rise, barefoot on the frozen ground, and search by memory, not sight, for the flint and steel. The mother, still wrapped in a wool cloak, would whisper to the children, tucking them tighter beneath straw and sheep wool. He struck the flint gently, over and over. No rush, because rushing wasted strength, and strength was everything. Sometimes it took minutes, sometimes longer, but then the spark, a whisper of light, a flicker of heat, and slowly the red would return to the heart of the hearth. The children didn't cheer. They were too used to it. But in the quiet, you could almost hear them sigh, not from fear, but from gratitude. They had fire again. And that was enough. Chapter 5. The blanket beneath the sky. Not all peasants had cottages. Some were wanderers. Some were landless. Some slept in barns or under makeshift shelters. One such soul was old Ulrich, a man with a limp and a soft voice, who traveled between villages trading tales for bread. He carried no possessions, except a small iron pan, a sack of oats, and a thick woolen cloak that smelled of earth and thyme. On the coldest nights, he slept beneath haystacks, or beneath the low branches of pine trees, when they grew thick enough to hold back the snow. He would build a tiny fire, just enough to warm a stone, which he then wrapped in cloth and tucked close to his chest. He called it his sunstone, though it never glowed. And above him, the stars would shimmer in silence. No roof, no walls. Just the turning sky, the breath of wolves in the dark, and the sound of frost forming on grass. And yet, Ulrich never cursed the cold. He said it reminded him that he was alive, that he still had stories, and hands to tell them with. And in his stillness, wrapped in nothing but cloth and memory, he outlasted more winters than most men with walls. Chapter 6. Threads of the Hearth. In winter, warmth was a kind of treasure, and like any treasure, it was passed carefully from one hand to another. At the loom in the corner of the cottage, the mother would weave wool into cloth. Not fine cloth, not colored or soft, but thick, scratchy, real. Every strand was spun by hand, every thread touched by breath and time. She made mittens for the youngest child, so they wouldn't cry in the night. She stitched patches onto her husband's sleeves, where the cold crept in first. She tied wool around her daughter's feet, layer upon layer, until they looked like little bundles of moss. Even the smallest scrap was saved, braided into cords, sewn into pillows, stuffed between cracks in the walls. Nothing was wasted, because warmth wasn't just heat, it was care, and every knot, every stitch, every slow, aching movement of her fingers whispered a quiet promise: you are not alone in this cold. We hold the night together, thread by thread. Chapter 7. The warmth between neighbors. In the middle of winter, when the wind howled like a hungry wolf through the bare trees, the villagers knew no one could survive the cold alone. One evening, as snow fell thick and silent, a knock came on the cottage door. It was Marta, an old widow who lived on the edge of the village. Her firewood was gone. Her hearth had gone dark. No one hesitated. They cleared a space for her. They gave her soup and a wool shawl. They placed her chair near the fire, the warmest place in the house. Because in winter, a neighbor was not a visitor. A neighbor was part of your fire. And Marta brought stories, told tales of saints and seasons, of harvests long gone, of a fox who once tricked a frost spirit. As she spoke, the children leaned close, their eyes wide with wonder, their cheeks flushed from the heat. That night, she didn't sleep cold. And the house was warmer, not just from the fire, but from the shared breath of kindness. In the hardest months, this is how they survived, not by having enough, but by sharing what little they had. Chapter 8. A Song in the Smoke. Sometimes, when words were too much and the cold pressed tight against the walls, someone would sing. Not loud, not proud, just soft, like a thread of smoke rising into the rafters. The songs were old, so old no one remembered who wrote them. Some had no words at all, just sounds that curled in the throat and wrapped around the fire. There was one song the mother always sang on the longest night of the year. It had only 3 lines: winter, go gently, we are not your enemy, we are only passing through. She sang it slowly, like a lullaby to the wind. And the wind, it seemed, would listen. Just a little. Just enough. The fire would flicker longer. The children would sleep deeper. The walls, thin as they were, would feel stronger. In that house, in many houses, song was not for joy alone. Song was a kind of spell against the silence. A shield against the cold that fire couldn't reach. And so they sang. Chapter 9. The Ritual of Stillness. There was one thing colder than the frost to fear. When nights turned sharp, and the food ran low, and the woodpile was only a handful of sticks, fear crept in like ice along the spine. But the elders had a cure for that, too. Each winter, on the coldest night they could bear, they performed the ritual of stillness. It was simple. They would let the fire go out on purpose. They would sit together in silence wrapped in wool, pressed side by side, and they would wait. No talking. No movement. Just breath. At first, the children fidgeted. The silence felt strange. But then, something happened. Their heartbeats slowed. Their breath grew deep. Their fear melted, not from heat, but from presence. They realized they were alive. They were together. And even in darkness, they could endure. After a time, the father would rise and relight the fire. And it would burn brighter than before. Because now, it wasn't just wood. It was a promise that stillness wasn't emptiness. It was strength. Chapter 10. A festival in the frost. Not every winter night was sorrow. Once a year, near the middle of the deepest cold, the villagers lit every candle they owned. They called it Fire Night. It had no fixed date. The elder women simply knew when the time had come, when the sky turned a deeper black, and the silence felt too heavy to carry any longer. That night, no one stayed in their own home. They gathered in the largest cottage, a barn, a hall, wherever the walls were wide. Each person brought what they could: a chunk of bread, a pot of stew, a handful of dried apples, an old song, or just their smile. Children were allowed to stay up late. Mothers wore flowers woven from straw. Fathers carved tiny birds from wood and gave them to the smallest hands. There was dancing, slow, clumsy, warm-footed dancing on the dirt floor. Someone always told the same joke about the rooster and the bishop, and everyone always laughed, because laughter, in winter, was as precious as firewood. And when the candles burned low and the stew was gone, they stood together and made one final promise: spring will come. And we will still be here. Then they walked home through the snow, hand in hand, with bellies full and hearts lit like lanterns. Chapter 11. Dreams beneath the thatched roof. At night, as the fire sank low and the cottage grew silent, the children dreamed. Not of dragons or castles, but of things far more magical. They dreamed of warm bread baked fresh in the morning. Of meadows without snow, where bare feet could run. Of the first flower peeking through frost. Some dreamed of faraway lands, not because they wanted to leave, but because in their dreams, the sky was always blue, and no one was ever cold. But the most cherished dream of all was the one where no one in the village was hungry. Where every belly was full. Every fire burned bright. And every old coat had a new patch sewn with golden thread. These dreams were never spoken aloud, not because they were secret, but because they were sacred. Each morning, they awoke with the memory of those dreams, like embers still glowing behind their eyes. And that was enough to rise, enough to smile, enough to begin another cold day. Chapter 12. The first light after the freeze. There always came a morning, soft, pale, nearly silent, when the air changed. You couldn't name it. You couldn't touch it. But you felt it. It was lighter. As if the wind had lost some of its bite. As if the snow had grown tired of falling. The birds hadn't returned. The trees were still bare. But the sky was just a little bluer. That morning, the villagers stepped outside with steaming breath and cautious hope. They looked at the frozen earth not with fear, but with patience. Because they had survived another stretch of long, cruel nights together, and though many weeks of cold still lay ahead, they knew something now. They were winter's equal. They could outlast the dark. They could find warmth in silence. They could turn suffering into song. And in every heart, from the oldest man to the smallest child, there burned a quiet fire. Not from wood, not from coal, but from the knowledge that they had endured. And tomorrow, they would endure again. Chapter 13. The sound of thaw. It didn't begin with sun. It began with drips. One by one. From the eaves of the thatched roof. From the edge of the old wooden cart. From the branches of the bare oak in the center of the village. Tiny drops of meltwater, falling slow as breath, striking the earth with a whisper like music. No one danced. No one shouted. But the moment the first drip was heard, the people listened. And smiled. Because they knew that sound. It was the sound of the world warming. The snow still held the fields tight in its white fist. The wind still pressed against the doors. But something invisible had shifted. Inside the barns, the animals stirred more eagerly. The bread rose a little faster in the oven. The children played longer before returning to the hearth. And in every corner of every cottage, hearts lifted not because the cold had left, but because it had begun to let go. Chapter 14: The Footprints in the Mud. When the first patch of earth appeared dark, wet, and soft where the snow had melted, it was almost holy. Children crowded around it. They touched it with bare fingers. They pressed their feet into it and laughed at the squelching sound. It wasn't beautiful. It was messy and brown and smelled of damp straw, but it was life. Soon, footprints marked the paths between homes, not through snow, but through waking ground. The peasants moved slowly, almost reverently. Along these muddy trails, some carried buckets of water to the animals. Some checked fences long buried in frost. Some just walked out to feel the earth again under their feet. One boy knelt beside a puddle, watching his reflection ripple with the breeze. "This is spring," he whispered. "Not flowers. Not warmth, just mud." And for those who had survived the long silence of winter, that was miracle enough. Chapter 15: What the Cold Left Behind. Even as the sun returned and the frost retreated to the mountains, the cold did not leave empty-handed. It had taken things. A fence that would need mending. A sick lamb that hadn't made it through. An old neighbor whose chair by the hearth now sat still. But the cold had left things too. It left closer families who had shared soup and silence. It left thicker blankets, sewn from scraps and love. It left songs that would be passed on, winter after winter. And most of all, it left wisdom that no season, not even the cruelest, could last forever. That kindness was the greatest warmth. And that the smallest light could keep a soul alive, even in the longest night. So when spring finally stepped through the village gate, she found a people stronger, quieter, and more grateful than before. Not because they were unafraid, but because they had walked through the dark together and come out the other side, still standing, still singing, still here. Chapter 16: Summer Stories of Snow. The sun was high, fields were green, chickens pecked the ground. Children ran barefoot through puddles left by summer rain. But in the evenings when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long, the elders still spoke of winter, around the hearth, though no fire burned now. They gathered the children close and told stories. Stories not of danger, but of bravery. Of how the smallest log had lasted 3 nights. Of the time the wind tried to tear the roof away, and the family sang to keep it calm. The children listened with wide eyes. "It couldn't have been that cold," they whispered. The elders only smiled. Because they know no words could carry the true weight of winter. But still, they told the stories. Because one day, these same children would sit before dying coals, and remember, and they would not be afraid. Chapter 17: Preparing for the Silence. As the leaves began to turn and the earth thinned with the scent of coming frost, the peasants moved with quiet purpose. They patched the roof again, even the parts that hadn't yet leaked. They cleaned the chimney. They stacked wood until it towered over the little ones. The mother stitched more wool socks. The father traded for dried beans and onions. The children helped salt meat and hang herbs from the beams. They worked without panic. There was no rush, because winter was not an enemy. It was a guest they had learned to welcome properly. And with every log stacked, every jar sealed, every crack filled with straw and cloth, they were whispering a quiet spell. "We are ready. Come cold, if you must. You will not find us unkind, nor unprepared." And when the first frost kissed the windows again, they did not tremble. They nodded and closed the door gently behind them. Chapter 18: The Fire in the Heart. In the end, it was never truly about the wood or the blankets. It was never just about the roof, or the stew, or the mittens. What helped them survive the coldest nights was each other. A glance shared in silence. A bowl passed without being asked. A blanket tugged up higher on a sleeping child's shoulder. These small things done again and again wove an invisible heat stronger than any fire. It was the heat of belonging, of hands held through the dark, of hope kindled, not in the hearth, but in the chest. And even in spring, in summer, in golden autumn, that warmth remained. Not always seen, not always spoken, but carried quietly, like a glowing coal in the heart. So that when the cold came again, and it always did, they would be ready. Because they had built something the frost could never touch, a warmth that lived inside them, always. Chapter 19, Traces in the Wood Grain. Even long after the snow had melted and grass had grown thick again in the fields, winter still lived in the village, not as frost, but as memory. In the grain of the wood that lined the cottage walls were tiny black cracks left by nights of fierce cold. In the floorboards, soft and worn, there were dents where heavy boots had stood by the fire, and lighter ones where children had crouched near the warmth. Every mark told a story. Every groove held a moment. A night survived. A song sung in silence. A kindness offered when the world was dark. These signs were not erased by spring. They remained. And the villagers did not sand them away. Instead, they honored them. Because to live through winter was not just to endure, but to be changed gently, slowly, deeply. Like wood turned to iron by fire. Chapter 20, The Night That Comes Without Fear. There came a night not cold, not dangerous, but simply dark. The moon had hidden behind soft clouds. The air was still. The trees stood silent. And yet, something in the villagers stirred. A remembering. So, without speaking, they lit a small fire. Not out of need, but tradition. No one was hungry. No one was cold. But they gathered anyway, as they always had. They sat in peace, not urgency. And told no stories. And sang no songs. Just sat, together, watching the fire. And it was then they realized they were no longer afraid of the night. Because they had walked through the hardest nights already. The longest ones. The sharpest ones. And they had come out on the other side with hands still held, breath still warm, and love still intact. From then on, they didn't fear the cold. They welcomed it. As a teacher. A reminder. A quiet companion who, for a time, made the world slow enough to notice each other. Chapter 21, A Fire That Never Dies. In the final pages of the season, before snow would fall again, the youngest of the village asked his grandmother a question. Will the cold always come back? She nodded, gently brushing his hair. Yes, my love, she said. But so will we. He thought about this. And then he smiled. Because he knew the truth she'd hidden in her answer. That the fire they had built in their hearths, in their homes, and in their hearts was not made of wood alone. It was made of laughter in darkness, of shared silence, of stories passed on like torches. It was a fire that never truly died, only dimmed to rest. And when the wind howled again and snow touched the windows once more, they would be ready. Not with fear, but with warmth that had waited all along. Chapter 22, When the Wind Returns. The first chill breeze that whispered through the valley in early autumn was not feared but noticed. An old man paused while chopping wood. A girl, no longer quite a child, looked up from gathering berries. It begins again, she murmured, not with dread, but with recognition. Like hearing the footsteps of an old friend approaching from far down a familiar road. Because the wind that came was not cruel, not yet. It was a reminder. A signal that life was turning inward again. The firewood stack was measured without rush. Wool blankets were shaken out, not with anxiety, but care. Even the animals, the sheep, the oxen, the hens seemed to know. Soon the world would quiet again. But this time, no one met it with worry. Because the last winter had taught them something precious, that cold is a season, but warmth is a choice. And they had chosen it before. And they would choose it again. Chapter 23, What the Grandmothers Teach. In every village, there are women whose hands are always moving. They sew. They bake. They carry warmth in their gaze, and wisdom in the way they pour water from kettle to cup. In the quiet evenings, the grandmothers gathered the children around their knees not to frighten them with tales of frost, but to teach them how to carry light. Here's how you twist wool so it won't unravel. Here's how you bank the coals so they burn longer through the night. Hear us how you make broth when the cupboard is nearly empty and how to share it so no one feels hunger alone. They didn't speak with fear. They spoke with love. Because they knew winter could take much. But it could not take what was taught, nor what was shared. And long after the last snow would melt, those teachings would live on like secret spells woven into scarves. Like lullabies sung into loaves of bread. Chapter 24. A warmth passed on. As years passed, the seasons circled again and again. New babies were born. Old hands grew still. Cottages changed slowly, gently, but one thing never changed each winter. A fire was lit, not just in the hearth, but in the hearts of those who remembered. Children grew, and when they felt that first sharp wind bite at their cheeks, they smiled. They knew what to do. They had seen. They had learned. The kindness that once warmed their toes was now in their own hands, baking bread, tucking blankets, whispering stories. And so the warmth moved forward, quietly, endlessly. Not just surviving winter, but carrying something through it, from soul to soul. Because the truest fire was always in the giving. Chapter 25. Snow falling on stories. The fire crackled. Outside, snow began to fall again, not in fury, but in silence. A little boy pressed his nose to the window. Behind him, his grandmother wrapped another shawl around his shoulders and said, "Let me tell you something." He turned, blinking. "Is it scary?" She smiled. "No, it's strong." And so, as the snow built up gently outside the old stone cottage, she told the story. Not just of her winter, but of all winters. Of the cold that tried to take everything. And of the people who shared what little they had. Of the dark that came early. And the warmth that stayed late. Her voice was soft, slow, steady like snow drifting down. By the end of the story, the boy had curled beside her, eyes fluttering shut, and in his dreams, he walked through a winter that did not frighten him. Because he had already been wrapped in the memory of survival. Chapter 26. A candle in every window. Years passed. The cottages changed. New roofs, new walls, new hands. But one thing never changed. When the first frost came, candles appeared in every window. Not because the light was needed, but because of what it meant. It meant someone had remembered. Someone had listened. Someone had been told the story, and kept it alive. A candle for the ones who came before. A candle for the ones who would come next. A flame so small, and yet strong enough to chase away the dark. From the outside, the village seemed still, quiet. But if you stood in the snow and looked through the windows, you'd see mittens drying near the hearth. Hands knitting. A stew bubbling slowly. Laughter. Light. Life. And all of it passed down from one winter to the next. Chapter 27. What winter cannot take. In the end, winter still came. It always would. The cold would return. The nights would lengthen. The wood would need chopping again. But the peasants were no longer peasants in hardship, they were keepers of warmth. What began as survival had become something gentler, greater. A way of loving. A way of remembering. A quiet strength carried in hands, in hearts, in stories. Because the truth is this, winter can take leaves. It can take light. It can take time. But it cannot take what has been shared freely. It cannot touch the warmth that lives in memory. And it cannot reach the fire built inside those who choose to care for one another. So sleep now. Let the night fall. Let the frost come tapping. There is a fire inside you, too. And it will burn it gently until morning. Always. Chapter 28. The grown child who once listened. There was a man in the village, tall, now quiet, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Years ago, he had been the boy who listened at his grandmother's knee, who fell asleep to tales of fire and frost, who once pressed his face to icy windows in wonder. Now, he split wood. He repaired the roof before the first snow fell. He made stew before anyone asked. He didn't think much of it. But when the first winter night came, and a small child tugged on his sleeve and asked, "Is it true?" That winter once almost took everything. He paused. Then he nodded, knelt, and said softly, "Yes." But we never let it. And so the story began again. Chapter 29. Even the animals know the barn cat curled tighter on the hay. The chickens fluffed their feathers against each other. The old dog stretched beside the hearth, snoring softly. No one told them stories. No one handed them mittens or bowls of stew. But they knew. They had felt the way the people moved slower in winter or gentler. They had watched the hands that mended cloaks also scratch behind ears and refill troughs. And in their own way, the animals became part of it all. They warned of storms by howling early. They shared their warmth. They reminded the children that love comes in many forms, some with fur and feathers. And when the wind howled again, the people made room. Not just for each other, but for every living thing that needed to be kept warm. Because what survived the cold was never just people. Chapter 30. A book wrapped in wool in one small cottage, kept in a drawer lined with old linen, lay a book. It had no gold, no name on its cover. Only soft pages, handwritten and worn at the corners. It had been started by someone long ago, a mother, maybe, or a son with good penmanship. Inside were pages and pages of knowledge, but not the kind found in castles: how to twist hay so it keeps the wind out, how to bake bread with only ashes, salt, and hope, how to light a fire in wet snow, how to hold a child so they fall asleep faster. And, in between the tips and the drawings and the ink smudges, were lines like this: kindness is a kind of fuel. Cold cannot enter a room full of laughter. Always leave a blanket by the door. The book was old and priceless. And it was not forgotten. Each year, someone new added a page. The fire still burned. Now it had ink to feed it. Chapter 31. The winter within us in the end. Though there was no true end, there came a time when the people no longer asked, "Will we survive the winter?" They asked, "What will we remember from it?" Because the cold no longer frightened them. It humbled them. It softened them. They stopped seeing it as something to resist and began seeing it as something to meet. With preparation. With patience. With open arms. And when new children were born, they were not taught only how to walk or speak, but how to wait out the storm, how to light a candle in darkness, how to share the last piece of bread with joy, not fear. Because surviving the coldest nights was never about beating the frost. It was about learning to burn brighter within. And so the story continued, not on pages, not just in voices, but in every gesture of care. In every blanket folded. In every window glowing softly in the snow. The fire was eternal now. It lived in them. Chapter 32. The road beyond the village. There came a time when one of the village's sons, now a young man with his own satchel and boots, decided to leave for a while. Not because he didn't love the village, but because he wanted to carry its warmth beyond it. He packed bread and wool, a small knife, and one secret, a jar of ashes from the family hearth, wrapped in cloth. As he walked through forests and across rivers, he met people in other places, people who had never heard of the old stories. People whose winters had been quiet in different ways. He didn't teach them in words. He did what he had seen all his life. He listened. He shared. He built fires. He folded extra blankets at night. He handed out warmth not as advice, but as habit. And slowly, wherever he passed, something changed. People lit candles in windows. They ate together. They waited out storms in silence, but together. He never called it tradition. But it was. Chapter 33. The star of the fire remembered one cold, clear night, when frost clung even to eyelashes and roofs. A child stepped out of the cottage to fetch snow for water. She looked up. The sky was sharp and deep and scattered with stars, as if a million stories had been thrown across the heavens and frozen there. One star flickered oddly. She stared at it, wondering. She had no name for it. But something inside her stirred. She returned inside, cheeks pink, and sat beside her grandfather's chair. "There's a star out there that's flickering," she whispered. Like it's shivering. The old man didn't open his eyes. "Maybe it's a fire someone forgot to protect," he murmured. "Maybe it needs remembering." And so she closed her eyes too, and pictured the star warm, and told it in her heart everything the fire had ever told her. The next night, the star was steady again, and deep in the hearth, one coal glowed just a little longer than usual. Chapter 34. When you wake in the night years, maybe centuries later, in a world with different walls and different ways, someone will wake in the dark. They may not know why. The heater will hum. The wind will sigh. But something will be missing, some flicker, some memory. And they will rise, quietly. They will light a small candle, not knowing why it feels right. They will sit for a moment, letting the silence be warm instead of cold. And they may remember a story not quite clearly, not by name. But something like, someone once made it through a hard winter. And because of that, I can too. The words won't matter. Only the warmth will. Because the truth is, the fire we tend inside ourselves doesn't forget. Even across time. Even in cities. Even in silence. Someone long ago gave you their warmth, and you've been carrying it ever since. Chapter 35. Where stories fold into stories. In a quiet room with stone walls and a heavy wooden beam above the fire, a young mother sat with her child tucked against her side. The world outside had changed. There were clocks now, tall and ticking. Books with gilded covers. A world of roads and maps. But in this little room, she told the old story once more. Not word for word. Not as history. But as a dream. Long ago, she whispered, people faced winters so cold their breath turned to silver. What did they do? The child asked. She smiled and brushed a bit of hair from the child's forehead. They gave each other warmth. Did it work? Yes, she said, voice a hush. And that's why we are here. The child didn't ask more. He only closed his eyes. And somewhere inside him, a new copy of the story folded itself away, soft and invisible, waiting for its time. Chapter 36. When time forgot, but the heart remembered. Time passed as it always does. The tools changed. The roofs changed. Even the winters changed. But in certain small ways, certain people kept doing the same things. A stranger was offered stew, even when food was scarce. A grandmother wear upon socks in midsummer, just in case. A shop window had a candle glowing after dark, though no one noticed who lit it. No one spoke of the old village. No one remembered the names of those who once faced the deep frost. And yet, their choices still lived. Because kindness, when repeated, becomes part of the world. Not because it's remembered, but because it's needed. Even in a world that forgets, the heart remembers how to be warm. And that is enough. Chapter 37. What we leave in the cold. At the very edge of winter, where the night is longest and the sky most quiet, there is a place where stories rest. Not buried. Not hidden. Just resting like logs in glowing embers. And if you are very still, and your room is dark but safe, you may feel them, the sound of hands rubbing together before a shared cup. The slow breath of someone asleep beside a fire. The weight of a blanket made by someone who loved you without needing to say so. These are not ghosts. They are not lost. They are gifts. What we leave in the cold to our warmth, our care, our fire is what lasts. The frost will melt. The snow will pass. But the warmth passed from hand to hand, across lifetimes. That will burn quietly, forever. Chapter 38. The last coal. In the old part of the village, though no one called it that anymore, there was a single hearth that had never gone cold. Not once. Even as new chimneys rose, even as the town grew brighter and busier, this one hearth, nestled in the foundation of a low stone house, held a coal that had been carefully tended for generations. A small ember. Nothing grand. But someone had always watched it. Someone had always whispered, "Don't let it go." They didn't need it to cook anymore. They didn't need it for light. But they needed it for something quieter. To remember. To connect. To feel the gentle weight of belonging. And when the night came, the coldest in 100 years, the people returned to that place, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They brought their children, and their stories, and their warmth. The last coal glowed just a little brighter. Chapter 39. When winter knocked softly that winter, the snow came without fury. It blanketed the village gently, like a hand tucking in a child for the night. The wind passed through the trees not with a howl, but with a hush. The people still lit their candles, still pulled close to one another, but they didn't brace for survival anymore. They welcomed the cold, because now they understood winter was not the enemy. It was a visitor, a mirror, a reminder to slow down, to hold close, to tend what matters most. And so, when winter knocked at the door, the people opened it and invited it to sit by the fire. No fear, no trembling. Just warmth shared, as it always had been. Chapter 40. The fire that sleeps in you tonight. Somewhere far from that village, perhaps in a place with no snow, no stone hearth, no steaming stew, someone lies awake. They don't know this story. Not in words. But they feel something old and soft stir within them, a longing for warmth that's not just heat, but belonging. And maybe they rise, light a small candle, hold a mug in their hands, and think of someone, somewhere, who once waited out the cold with them in mind. Because the truth is, you do not need to know the whole story to carry its warmth. You already do. It's in the way you check on others when the nights grow long. It's in the way you wrap a blanket twice. It's in the way you wait for someone to fall asleep before turning out the light. That fire, the one that saw peasants through their coldest nights, is sleeping in you now. Let it glow quietly, gently, until morning. Epilogue. The fire speaks softly. I am the fire. I have no voice, but I've spoken in every crackle of wood, every hush before the snow fell. You didn't always see me, but I was there. When hands pulled wool tight around thin shoulders, I was there. When bread was broken in halves instead of wholes, I was there. When someone whispered, "Let's hold on one more night," I listened, and I stayed. You think the peasants survived the coldest nights? They didn't just survive. They taught the night how to listen. They taught the frost how to soften. And now I live in you. Not in logs, not in hearths, but in how you wait for someone in silence, how you add a blanket even when no one asks, how you remember someone you've never met and care. So sleep now, with no fear of the dark. Because the oldest fire in the world, the one that kept a village warm through centuries, is here. Still glowing. Still gentle. Still yours. Good night.